The world is not risk-free. We manage risks in our daily lives, but when there are societal risks, which affect a lot more people, we expect governments to help diminish these risks. And so, we accept that sometimes governments have the right to intrude on our personal lives, like telling us what we can or cannot pack in our luggage before boarding a plane. But never before in modern history have governments controlled when and how we can leave our homes, told us to cover our faces, or even shut the doors to our places of worship. These are emergency powers. But as of late August 2020, nearly 800,000 people worldwide have died from COVID-19. And this has fundamentally changed the relationship between the people and their government. Beyond the liberties we've forfeited in order to save lives, governments have also addressed the economic consequences as businesses are ordered to close as a way to lessen the spread of the virus. Governments worldwide are being tested like never before to protect their citizens and economies. So, how well are they doing? How do we even begin to measure how they're doing, while there is still so much confusion and ambiguity surrounding the virus? Ultimately, what ability do we have as voters to hold our government accountable? In this global health crisis, there is a parallel crisis of governing and governments. That is where the LSE Department of Government has something to offer. We're going to look at the research of academics who are seeking to understand where governments are failing and where they are succeeding. First, let's look at how COVID has impacted some of our democratic rights. Do we have to forfeit democracy in order to battle the virus? Just how far can governments use emergency powers to safeguard our health, our lives, and our economies? And how do we know when governments are misusing these new powers?
This pandemic could be exploited by, for example, a government or a leader who uses the pandemic to circumvent the right to oppose him or her, or to shut down elections and so on. One example we saw of that in the start of the pandemic was in Hungary, where the controversial Prime Minister Orban went out and asked Parliament to grant him emergency powers that basically meant he could rule by decree indefinitely. People really value regular elections? Do they really value the right to go out and protest? Do they value their individual rights to be able to go outside a house without face coverings? Or are they quite willing, in the case of a crisis like a pandemic, to say, okay, these things are nice to have, but they don't really matter? We found that there's generally very high levels of support for policy measures that have limited individual rights and collective rights in response to COVID-19. We also find some differences across the US and the UK. When comparing those two countries, we find Americans are generally more opposed to measures that restrict individual and collective rights than Brits. For example, the Brits have been very supportive of postponing elections, whereas Americans are more reluctant. That might have something to do with the fact there's an important election coming up in the US shortly. Another thing that mattered was, of course, it hasn't been as politicized in the UK as in the US. The Labour opposition have been critical of individual parts of the government's response in terms of care homes and whether they now lock down too late. But it hasn't been as politicized in any way to the degree that it has in the United States. One of the things we find is that it really matters who the messenger is when it comes to support for these public measures. When there's a public health expert who advises that a certain measure should be adopted, people are much more likely to support it.
Over the duration of the crisis, citizens or survey respondents that we interviewed show higher levels of authoritarian attitudes and consistently higher levels over time.
Now, if on average public responses lean towards more authoritarian government practices, then we're going to face a whole new question. How do we keep our governments accountable?
The legality or the actions will be sort of held to account afterwards in sort of an inquiry type setting. The problem is, A, you could say the time is not enough for politicians to ponder this, but B, most often they don't want to ponder this either because that just means blame. If you have a bad pandemic, I think your electoral chances will go down. I mean, you can see that in the German context. So the election next year, nobody knows who's going to be the Christian Democrat Chancellor candidate. And out of nowhere, this Bavarian bloke has turned up as being sort of Mr. Pandemic because sort of people think he sort of had a very good pandemic. Across countries, we've been obsessed by all sorts of numbers, right? And I think that is sort of an interesting implication for accountability, right? So at first it was about this R number, which nobody had ever heard of it before.
R stands for reproduction number. It's the average number of people that one infected person will pass the virus on to. The R number should remain under 1. This way the virus will slowly dissipate and eventually disappear. The way this is measured is actually by going backwards, using data such as the number of fatalities, hospital admissions, or positive tests for the virus, allow us to estimate how easily the virus is spreading. But if you think this is the most important number, it's crucial to remember that both the case numbers in existence and severity play just as big a role in guiding us out of lockdown.
Ultimately, none of these numbers really tell you whether the state has a control over a pandemic.
Now, with this research being collected and questions being asked, it's important to see how this is being translated into tangible advice for governments.
Where I've come in terms of encouraging in some ways, discouraging in other ways, and suggesting politicians and government policies that favor massive investment in public rather than private transport, even under these conditions that demand social distancing for rising numbers of passengers, commuters returning to work and school.
Finally, let's look at voting. With elections coming up, there's differing views on how to proceed. But what does this mean for you?
Democracy can't be suspended. The most, effective means of actually mobilizing voters, of persuading them, is face-to-face contact. But I think we'll see a massive acceleration of digital campaign methods, social media ads, Facebook and Instagram, on Snapchat, and these are things that have been happening anyways. But I think we'll see a massive acceleration of those trends. If we can use digital methods to actually reach, for instance, underregistered groups, people who, move addresses a lot, or young people, right? I mean, like who, wouldn't necessarily be easily reachable by sending them a mailer through the post. The issue is queues in front of polling stations in the US are much longer in black areas than in white areas. There are fewer polling stations. They're further away. Some countries, really, voting is getting more difficult, not less difficult. Obviously, there's a lot of fake news shared, etc. So, digital campaigning also comes with those dangers. The big question is obviously whether these methods are as effective as traditional voter contact methods.
Overall, these times are messy. There's no rule book to stick to, no roadmap to follow, and no signposts telling us how far to go. But this will end. Right now, we need to prepare the kind of world we'll have when it does.